Hi, my name is Ryan Thompson, and I'm the mechanics interpreter for the Midwest Buckeye Umpires Association out of Van Wert, Ohio. And over the many years of officiating on the field and umpiring baseball and also teaching new umpires, I've been asked questions multiple times about how to effectively manage a lineup card during a baseball game to keep track of substitutions and conferences. And so in today's presentation, I'm going to go through and show you some different ways that you might use to effectively keep track of a lineup, make sure that you're documenting substitutions accurately, and hopefully give you some tools to take away to improve how you're managing your lineup card during a baseball game. So in today's presentation, we're going to briefly touch on what the rulebook says about the lineup card, and then go into what to do during pregame conference, at the plate conference with the coaches to make sure that you have an accurate lineup card to start with. We're going to talk about documenting substitutions and some different ways to do that. We're going to go through some scenarios, substitution scenarios with a straight nine lineup, designated hitter lineup, a lineup that includes a player DH, and then we're going to talk about recording offensive and defensive conferences, documenting some information in the event you have official warnings or ejections during your game, and then what information needs to be captured on the lineup card in the event that your game is suspended or cut short due to weather or other factors. So the rulebook says in Rule 1 that it's the head coach's responsibility to provide the umpire-in-chief with his team's lineup card. That shall include the name, shirt number, and position and batting order of each starting player, as well as the name and shirt number of each eligible substitute that they have on their team. And that if any of that information is missing, that the umpire should not accept the lineup card, but rather give that back to the coach and ask him to please include the missing information. Typically, we're looking at substitutes. Sometimes coaches forget to include their substitutes on the back of the lineup card and are willing to add them on there if you ask. Also understand that in high school baseball, if a coach gives you a lineup card that has substitutes listed, and then later on in the game attempts to enter a substitute that was not on the lineup card at the beginning of the game, that player is eligible to enter the game. Just because they weren't listed on the lineup card at the beginning of the game, that does not prevent them from participating. For example, maybe you get late into the game and the junior varsity baseball game finishes up and some of those players come up and the coach wants to enter one of the JV players to pinch run, and you notice that that player was not listed on the official lineup card. That player is an eligible substitute as long as he is not violating any of the substitution rules. Again, just because a player is not listed does not prevent that player from participating. Rule 4 talks about that before the game, the home team and then the visiting team shall deliver their lineups to the umpire-in-chief. So that tells us we always take the home team's lineup card first at the plate conference, look through that and certify that, and then we take the visiting team's lineup card and certifies theirs next. The umpire should then permit inspection by both head coaches, and each team lineup card needs to list a minimum of 9 players to start the game. Then once the plate umpire has officially certified those lineup cards and accepted those lineup cards, the substitution regulations in Rule 3 are in effect at that time. So at the pregame conference, we talked about taking the home team's lineup card first. One of the first things I do on my lineup card is when a coach gives them to me, shortly after introducing ourselves, and I always introduce myself with my first and last name, and I expect a coach to introduce themselves the same way, is at the top of that baseball card, I'm going to write the head coach's first name. So for example, if he introduces himself and his first name is Tom, I'm going to put that at the top of the lineup card. That's helpful for me. Sometimes late in the game or in the second, third inning, the head coach's name has slipped my mind if I'm not familiar with the team or maybe never had this team before. And it's a great reference for me to be able to open up my lineup card and go back and just refresh my memory on what is that head coach's team, the head coach's name. The other piece of information I write at the top of my card is I write the catcher's name. Again, the catcher and the head coach are the 2 people on that team that I'm probably communicating with the most, and it's just helpful for me to have those names written down at the top of my card. Oftentimes, if I write the name down It helps me memorize it. If I do forget the name, at least I have a reference to go back. And I do that for both teams, capturing the head coach's name and the catcher's name at the top of my lineup card. So when I get this lineup card, first thing I do is I check names, shirt numbers, and positions. I check for 9 players. The way I check for 9 players is I just go through the positions, identifying that I have a defensive player at each position. So I double check that I have a pitcher, I have a catcher, I have a first baseman, second baseman, third baseman, shortstop, left fielder, center fielder, right fielder. So I just go down through the position numbers 1 through 9 to make sure that I have 9 defensive players. And I make sure that each defensive player is assigned to a different position. Usually once a season, maybe twice a season, I'll catch an error on a lineup card where a coach has mistakenly assigned the same defensive player to the same position. And so obviously if I go through and check that, we can get that corrected before we start the baseball game. I also take a quick look, make sure I have uniform numbers for all my starting players. I flip the card over to double check that the coach has listed substitutes with their numbers on the back of that card. As we continue through the plate conference, I double check with that particular coach that all of his players are legally and properly equipped to the best of his knowledge, and I would expect that somewhere on this lineup card there is a signature that indicates that indeed his players are legally and properly equipped. So at a pregame conference, I may get a lineup card that identifies that I quickly see that there's a designated hitter. So in that particular situation, I'm going to go through the same routine, looking for a pitcher, catcher, first baseman, and I can see my first baseman is listed down here in the number 10 spot. So I'm assuming that's the defensive player for the DH. Continuing on, a second baseman, third baseman, shortstop, left fielder, center fielder, right fielder. At that time, I'm going to ask the coach to confirm that according to his lineup card, it appears that Daniels is the designated hitter, batting in the number 4 spot, and he is hitting for Jones, the first baseman, and looking for the coach to confirm that. I see this written a variety of different ways on different lineup cards. Sometimes a coach will just draw a line and they'll put, my first baseman is Jones. Sometimes they'll write it down underneath that Jones is my first baseman for Daniels. However they write it, just take a moment to make sure that you're understanding how it's being written on the lineup card. Maybe make any notes or circle something that makes sense to you so you know clearly who is the designated hitter and who is the defensive player. You may get a lineup card that identifies that we have a player DH. And in this particular situation, my procedure is the same. I look for a pitcher, catcher. I see I have a player DH at first base, second baseman, third baseman, short, left, center, right. And I am going to ask the coach to confirm that it appears on your lineup card you're using a player DH, that Daniels is your starting player DH in the number 4 spot, and he will be starting the game at third base, but also occupying your designated hitter position as well. Looking for him to confirm that. Once that's confirmed, down at the bottom of my lineup card, I'm going to go ahead and write that in, that my first baseman is Daniels, and he is holding down the defensive half of that player DH position. And I'll show you as we get into substitutions, having it split apart like that makes it easier to record the defensive changes that may occur during the course of the game. One of the things I want to talk about too is when you get that lineup card, it's important to identify a system that works for you. You want to make sure that your system, you can identify the substitutions that have been made. You want to be able to identify who has re-entry status and where has a player re-entered. Also identifying players who do not have re-entry status that are no longer eligible to participate in that baseball game. So during the course of a game, when I get a lineup card, what works best for me is I assign a letter system to my substitutes. So for example, if a coach identifies to me that King is entering the game for Abel, I flip over to the back of my card, I find the substitute King. I'm going to assign him a letter A because he's my first substitute. Flip my card back over, I find Abel. Abel is now out of the game. King is in for Abel, and I just write an A. That way, if there are spellings that I'm unfamiliar with, or if maybe I'm struggling reading the coach's handwriting on the back of the card, but I know this first guy is King, but I'm not quite sure how he spelled it. Assigning a letter is a quicker, more efficient way for me to keep track of substitutions. Some umpires use numbers, and that's another efficient way that you can do it. So, for example, if a coach tells you that number 13 Lewis is entering for number 14 Baker, some guys will mark that Baker's out. They'll just put a number 13 here to identify that number 13 Lewis has entered the game for Baker. And then if it works best for you to use names, there's nothing wrong with using the last names. I find it more difficult to write those full last names. Sometimes if they have odd spellings, or maybe I struggle to read a coach's handwriting on the back of the card. But for example, if the coach tells you Miller is in for Charles, you can simply identify that Charles is out and indicate that Miller is in the game. That's another effective way to do that. Again, find a way that makes sense to you, that's efficient and quick for you to use during a game. You want to make sure that your substitutions are captured accurately, but you also want to make sure that you're not holding up or further delaying the game in an attempt to document substitutions. Now, to indicate re-entry, the system I use for re-entry is is simply an arrow. So, for example, in the number 1 spot of my lineup, if the coach tells me that Abel is going to re-enter, I just simply draw an arrow over the top of the substitute, and I put 2 arrows or 2 lines through King, because any player on my lineup that has 2 lines through them identifies to me that that player is no longer eligible to re-enter into today's game. So I just use a simple arrow over the top of my substitute to identify Abel has re-entered and King is out of the baseball game and is not eligible to re-enter. So we're going to go through some different situations. First, we're going to start with a straight 9-man lineup that in the 5th inning, King bats for Abel. So again, my first substitute of the day is assigned the letter A. King bats for Abel. 1 line through Abel identifies he was a starter, and 1 line means he's been out of the game, but he still is eligible to re-enter. So King then singles, and Abel re-enters to run for King. So just a line over the top identifies that Abel has re-entered. King gets 2 lines drawn through him for me to recognize he is no longer eligible to return into today's game. Then in the bottom of the 6th, Nelson enters the game for George as the catcher. So Nelson is my second substitute. I'll assign him letter B. He's in for George, so 1 line through George, letter B here. In the top of the 7th, George re-enters to bat. So when George re-enters, just a line over the top of Nelson, 2 lines through Nelson now that he's out, identifies he does not have eligibility to re-enter. In the bottom of the 7th, Miller now enters the game as the catcher. Miller's my 3rd substitute. Miller now enters for George, so just on this same line, I'm going to put a C, and I'm going to put a 2nd line through George to identify that he is no longer eligible to re-enter into today's game. So here's a lineup card where I've taken at the plate conference and I've quickly identified we have a designated hitter. In this situation, it's important to understand these are 2 separate positions. The designated hitter and the defensive position, the defensive starter, each hold their own separate position. Each of these players does have re-entry status if they leave the game and re-enter. Each position can be substituted for independently of one another, and it's important to know when the role of the DH is terminated. Most often this is described as when the offense goes to defense or the defense to offense. So in this situation, if Daniels, my offensive player, enters the game to play a defensive position, the role of the DH is terminated. Or if Jones, my defensive player, enters the game to hit or pinch run on offense, the role of the DH is also terminated. In those situations, each of these players may still have re-entry status, and it's important to be able to keep track of that on your lineup card to identify who has actually left the game and who has stayed in the game, but perhaps just in a different capacity. So here's a DH substitution situation we're going to go through. That the 4th inning, Lewis pinch hits for Daniels. So Lewis is my first substitution. I'll assign him letter A. He pinch hits for Daniels. I put one line through Daniels and identify that Lewis is in for Daniels. In the 5th inning, Daniels re-enters to hit. So I just draw an arrow that Daniels re-enters. Lewis is now done for the day. He gets 2 lines put through him. In the 7th inning, Daniels is now brought in to pitch, and Frank moves to first base. So for Daniels to enter the game on defense, both Daniels and Jones are both locked into the 4 spot. So Jones is now out of the game because Daniels has entered to pitch. So Jones is the only player that can come out. And Daniels enters the pitch. So since Daniels, the offensive player, has entered the game on defense as the pitcher, that terminates the role of the DH. Daniels is now the pitcher. And it also tells us that Frank, who was the pitcher, now goes to first base. Typically, I don't keep track of defensive position changes on my lineup cards. The only ones that I may keep note of are who are the players that have pitched, especially in situations where maybe a pitcher has left the pitching position but has remained in the game. We know that he can return to pitch once per inning. It's also important to keep track of pitchers when a coach has used up all of their 3 charged defensive conferences, because we know that once they've exceeded those 3 charged defensive conferences, any further visits to the mound, that player is no longer permitted to pitch, must be removed as pitcher, and is no longer eligible to pitch for that game. So those are a couple defensive changes that I do keep track of, but just position changes, I usually do not indicate those on my lineup card. So Daniels is brought in to pitch. Frank moves to first base. After Daniels walks the first 2 batters, the coach wants to bring Jones in to pitch for Daniels. So I do have Jones listed down here at the bottom. 1 line through him indicates he was a starter. He is eligible to re-enter. He can re-enter for Daniels because they're both locked into that 4th spot of the lineup. So on my lineup card, I'm probably just going to write Jones in this situation to identify that Jones is now in the game for Daniels. Now Daniels is out of the game, and this is the 2nd time he's been out. I put a 2nd line now through Daniels. He is no longer eligible to re-enter into today's game. Another designated hitter situation, substitution that we'll go through, is Daniels, our designated hitter, hits a single, and the coach wants to have Jones pinch run. So we can see that our designated hitter, Daniels, in this particular situation, is hitting for Jones, and the coach now wants Jones to come in and pinch run for Daniels. So Daniels is out. In this particular situation, I'm just going to write Jones in here to identify that Jones is now in for Daniels to pinch run. The next time that this number 4 spot in the lineup comes up, coach wants Daniels to re-enter to hit. So Daniels, a starter, only been out once. He can re-enter. So I just draw a line here to identify that Daniels has re-entered now to hit. Now Jones is out for the first time. Daniels walks and gets on base. The coach wants Jones to re-enter to pinch run for Daniels. Now, Jones was a starter. This is the first time he's been out of the game because he moved from a defensive position into an offensive position. He had not been out of the game prior to this inning, and Jones does have eligibility to re-enter for Daniels, and when Daniels goes out, that's now his 2nd time out of the game, and Daniels can no longer return or no longer has re-entry status for today's game. Here's a lineup card where we see we have a player DH. It's important to understand that this player holds 2 positions, the DH position and the defensive position. So as I said earlier, when I get this lineup card, at the bottom of the lineup card, I'm going to identify my defensive player at the bottom of the lineup card to show that this player is holding the DH position, and this player is also holding the defensive position. Defensively, any eligible substitute may enter. The starting defensive player may re-enter 1 time. Offensively, if there's any substitutions for this player on offense, whether it's a pinch hitter or a pinch runner, the DH part of this player DH is terminated. And we know that we cannot have a courtesy runner for the player DH. The only exception to this would be if a coach comes out and identifies they would like to terminate the role of the player DH and now use a courtesy runner on that position for that player in the lineup. So a few player DH substitutions that we'll go through here. We see that Daniels is our player DH. And in the second inning, the coach enters King to play first base. So when I accept this lineup card, the first thing I'm going to do at the bottom is I'm going to record that Daniels is holding both of these positions. And King enters to play first base, so being my first substitute, I'm going to assign him letter A. And then down here at the bottom, defensively, I'm going to mark out Daniels. And I'm going to identify that King is in defensively for Daniels. In the fourth inning, Lewis now replaces King at first base. So Lewis, being my second substitute, gets letter B. And here King is done. Letter B is in at first base. King gets 2 lines through him because he is now no longer eligible to participate. And I have Lewis now in defensively at first base. In the seventh inning, Daniels returns to the game defensively. And so Daniels, being the starter pitcher DH, is permitted to return to defense. And so Daniels re-enters, and Lewis is now done for the day. So Daniels is now pitching back into the game on defense. He still assumes the DH position. One thing to note here that we can do this because Daniels is not locked into the first base position. He is locked into the fourth position in the batting lineup, but defensively, Daniels, the player DH, can be inserted into any defensive position. The next player DH scenario we have, again, when I get my lineup card, I'm going to identify this. The Daniels is holding both the offensive position and the defensive position. In the third inning, Nelson substitutes in for Daniels at first base. So Nelson is my first sub. He gets letter A. Daniels out. Nelson is now in defensively at first base. In the fourth inning, Daniels returns defensively. Okay, and now in the fifth inning, Miller enters the game for Daniels. So Miller is my second sub. Now enters the game for Daniels. Now, this is the second time that Daniels has left the lineup defensively. He can re-enter defensively one time, but now, once he goes out for the second time, that ends the role of the player DH. So now, in this particular situation, Miller is actually in the lineup in the 4 spot for Daniels and will be batting for himself because the player DH can enter defensively, re-enter one time. If he's taken out of the game again, then we revert back to a 9-man lineup. And so in this particular situation, Miller is now batting for himself in the 4 spot and also in the game on defense for Daniels. So another player DH situation with Daniels listed in the starting lineup as the first baseman DH and batting fourth. In the fifth inning, the coach wants Lewis to come in and hit for Daniels. So in this particular situation, my lineup card at the plate conference, I would have identified that Daniels is here as my first baseman defensively. And they want to bring in Lewis to hit for Daniels. So Lewis is my substitute A. Offensively, he comes here for Daniels. Now, when there's a substitution made, on offense for my player DH, that terminates the role of the player DH. So I'm no longer having a player DH position. Now, when I make that offensive substitution, Lewis is just straight in for Daniels, and we're back to a 9-man lineup. Because if Lewis enters to hit or run for Daniels on offense, the role of the DH is terminated for the game. If eligible, Daniels may re-enter the game on defense and bat in the same spot for himself in the batting order. Our last player DH situation, again, at the lineup, at the plate meeting, I'm going to identify that Daniels is also holding this defensive position for first base DH. Daniels sprains his ankle sliding into second base. The coach wants to put King in to run for Daniels because he's injured at second base. That's okay, but remember, when we make an offensive substitution for that player DH, that terminates the role of the player DH, and King actually goes straight in for Daniels, both offensively and defensively. King remains in the game, remains in the lineup. He bats again in the 6th inning in the number 4 spot of the lineup. In the 7th inning, coach wants to defensively enter Daniels into right field. So Daniels was my original player DH, who I forgot to mark here. He's out of the game because he had been injured sliding into second. King has come in for him. And the coach wants Daniels now in the 7th inning to come in for Ivan. This is not a substitution that we would permit because Daniels and King are both locked into the number 4 position in the batting lineup. That Daniels or any of his subs, in this situation King, are not permitted to be in the defensive lineup at the same time. So this is a substitution that would not be permitted to be made. Offensive and defensive conferences are important to document on your lineup card. We know that the defensive team each gets 3 charged conferences during a 7-inning game. And then if we go into extra innings, they're permitted to have 1 conference per extra inning. Those 3 conferences from the first 7-inning games do not carry over into extra innings. Each coach is granted 1 defensive conference per extra inning if we get into extra innings. So if your team happens to have or provided you with these well-organized lineup cards here, there is a great spot for you to keep track of charged conferences on the back of these lineup cards. And so if a team takes a defensive conference, this team takes their defensive conference in the 2nd inning, I just use a tally mark to identify that. Maybe they take another one in the 5th inning. Maybe they take another one in the 7th inning. We go into extra innings. And again, they're permitted to take 1 free charged conference per inning. I just identify those with tally marks on the defensive side of their charged conferences. Offensive conferences, I take a little bit more detail when documenting offensive charged conferences. I like to document the player at bat when the coach took the charged conference. Again, they get 1 offensive charged conference per inning. So in the 1st inning, if they took an offensive conference and while number 14 was at the plate, I'm just going to write number 14 in here so I know who was the batter when that charged conference was taken. Maybe they take another one in the 4th inning when number 8 was at the plate. The reason I include a batter's number is sometimes in a long inning or a team bats around, a coach may try to take a second charged offensive conference. And we know by rule we're just not supposed to permit that to happen. And if a coach asks, what do you mean I already took a charged conference this inning? I can pull up my lineup card and say, you already took a charged conference in the 4th inning. You took it when number 8 was your batter at the plate. So I try to record just a little bit more information on those offensive charged conferences. If you don't have a lineup card that has this little chart on here, what I typically do is I just write a D and I write an O, and this is where I'm going to record them. So defensively, let's say the home team took a defensive charged conference in the top of the 2nd. They took another one in the top of the 4th. Again, I have that documentation of what inning that was taken in. Offensive charged conferences, again, I'm going to record the inning and the player's number. So maybe they took an offensive charged conference in the bottom of the 3rd when number 14 was at the plate. And then again, they took another one in the bottom of the sixth when number 7 was at the plate. Again, I just like to keep track of what inning it was and who was the player at the plate when they took that offensive charged conference. Your lineup card is also important to keep track of official warnings that may be issued, or in the event you have ejection, you want to keep track of some information. Leading up to and handling those situations, you make sure that you go through the progression of trying to de-escalate that situation. One of the first things that I encourage umpires to do is if a coach has a disagreement or they're asking you a question, the best thing you can do is listen. Let him say what his disagreement is so you know how to answer his questions. And that's what I look for as an umpire. Is I'm looking for what questions are you asking me, because I can answer your questions. I can't always respond to statements. So listen first. Listen to hear what the coach's question is. Another useful tool is simply to acknowledge, a comment or a statement from a coach. If you hear a comment come from the dugout, maybe about a ball strike call, I may quickly glance in that direction and make eye contact with that coach to let him know that, yeah, I hear what you're saying to me, that I'm hearing your displeasure, or I heard you. And just a simple glance in that direction to make eye contact can acknowledge that you've heard what they've had to say. If it continues to escalate, we can issue a verbal warning. And just by identifying to the coach that I'm hearing you arguing balls and strikes, we're not arguing balls and strikes today, this is your verbal warning. That's an informal warning. Nothing necessarily needs to be documented, but you have officially addressed it verbally that behavior won't be tolerated or continued. If it continues to escalate further, at that point we issue an official written warning. If we issue an official written warning, that coach, if it's a head coach, that head coach would be restricted to the dugout at that point for the duration of the game. And it is just that, an official written warning, that we take out our lineup card and we're expected to make some documentation of who, what, and when and why that official warning was given. So there's all kinds of blank space here on my lineup card that I take advantage of in the event I need to issue written warnings or document some information. I encourage you to document who it was, what was the situation, how many outs there were, what the score was, and why the warning was given, what happened immediately prior to the warning. So, for example, we might say that a written warning, and again, I'm going to write this in shorthand that makes sense to me, and I might put the home team's head coach in the bottom of the third, a ball strike, verbal warning, and then again in the bottom of the fifth, a ball strike, written warning, and restricted to the dugout. Again, that's my official warning, was given in the bottom of the fifth. I might even put that the score was 0-1, and when that official written warning was given, number 24 at bat. Again, these are just quick notes that I can write down that in the event that this escalates to an ejection, I have documentation that I went through. I gave a verbal warning in this particular situation, and then in the bottom of the fifth, I gave a written warning and restricted him to the dugout. And then if it continues, maybe in the bottom of the seventh, ejection, head coach, arguing balls and strikes. The score was now, he was losing 0-2, number 27 on a called third strike. The head coach was arguing balls and strikes. So again, just some notes that will help me in writing that report in the event I need to recall that important information from the game. In the event you have a suspended game, a called suspended game that may be due to inclement weather or darkness, that if you've not met the criteria of a called regulation game for whatever reason, it's important to capture all the details. You should jot down some notes in all of your empty space on your card because there's a chance that you're not going to be the umpire who comes back to resume that called suspended game. So some of the most important details to capture: make sure you capture what inning you're in, top or bottom, how many outs there are, what's the count, who's the batter that's at the plate, are there runners on base? If so, what are the numbers of the runners who are on base? If there's any important notes about defensive positions, especially pitchers, are there certain pitchers who are no longer eligible to pitch today because of a coach has maximized their charged conferences? That's another important piece to document. How many charged conferences have been taken? Are there any substitutions on your lineup that you need to make sure are identified? What's the status of our designated hitter? What's the status of our player DH? And just make sure those substitutions are clearly noted on your lineup. Have there been any official warnings given to either team or players or coaches that need to be documented so the person coming to resume that game has that information? After you've captured all of those details, make sure that both of your cards, your home card and your visitor's card, are given to the home team when that game is officially suspended or postponed for a later date. And it's the home team's responsibility to hang on to both of those lineup cards and to give those cards to the umpires coming back to resume that game at a later date. So just in conclusion, a lineup card is a great tool that we have as umpires for helping to manage our game. A lot of times I think we do a pretty good job during school ball of managing and maintaining lineup cards. Oftentimes in the summer, I'll be officiating or observing baseball games, and I will see an umpire tell a coach that, hey, I don't need a lineup card today. You guys just keep track of your substitutions. Not a practice that I would encourage you to get into. I think it's best for an umpire to always have a lineup card, no matter if you're working a varsity tournament baseball game or a lower level summer game. That's my tool as the umpire to help me keep track of what's happening on the baseball diamond. All is good for coaches keeping track of their own substitutions until one of them identifies that the other coach has possibly done something illegal, and so, or has a substitution infraction. At that point, they're going to come to you and expect you to sort this out, and you're going to be left with no documentation. Same is true with charged conferences. I don't know how you would even remember who has held what conference, what inning it was in. So keeping a lineup card, like I said, no matter what level of game, is best practice for a baseball umpire. Like I said, it's not going to be an issue until there's an issue. And if you're in the habit of always having a lineup card, you can avoid a lot of potential confusion, or you can rectify certain situations if you have that documentation that you've kept during the baseball game. That wraps it up. Hopefully you've taken away some good pieces of information that'll maybe help you keep a more efficient or a more accurate lineup card during this upcoming season. Again, the most important piece is find a system that works for you. Find something that you can implement quickly on the baseball diamond that's not further delaying the game, that's highly accurate, and that you're confident that you understand. And that's really what's most important, is accurately capturing the details of a game in a way that's meaningful to you. So if you have any other questions or any other suggestions to share on maybe what works for you when keeping track of your lineup card, I'd love to hear from you. Feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is on there. And I wish everyone a safe and successful upcoming baseball season.